Chapter 9. Corruption is not a problem, it's a solution. In our theory, whatever law enforcement strategy the society chooses, private individuals will seek to subvert its working to benefit themselves. Edward L. Glaser and Andrew Schleifer, The Rise of the Regulatory State. The idea in brief: corruption has investors why they choose not to invest in certain reasons or ask citizens of those reasons why their countries are not developing. And corruption is almost always at the top of the list. A recent International Monetary Fund estimate put the annual cost of bribery alone at about 1.5 to $2 trillion. The overall economic and social costs of corruption are likely much larger since bribes constitute only one of the possible forms of corruption. The problem of corruption is so corrosive and widespread that hundreds of millions of dollars are spent annually trying to eradicate corruption around the world, and yet corruption is still stubbornly pervasive. In this chapter, we examine the problem of corruption differently. Instead of asking how can we eliminate corruption, we ask why does corruption persist at the first place? The answer, we believe, lies not solely in some fundamental moral failings, but rather in understanding why many people choose to hire corruption. History has shown that successful economics develop in spite of widespread corruption. Seen through a new set of lenses, we may understand corruption better, and we hope begin to find new ways to mitigate it. In today's most prosperous countries, proper enforcement of laws against corruption followed investments in innovations that either created new markets or grew and connected to existing ones. If we skate the sequence right, we can begin to stroke progress in even the most corrupt countries. When I was a missionary in South Korea, we were visited monthly by a man who was selling safety insurance. If you paid him, and it was not a small amount of money from our perspective, he would guarantee that your home would not be robbed. If you didn't buy that insurance, somebody picked your whole house clean. Making sure that our modest possessions were not taken away from us was important for our survival, so we paid. It's only in hindsight that I see that we were all willing participants in a form of low-grade corruption, the kind that establishes a power balance in local community, makes lives easier or harder for those unwilling to participate, and keeps the economic wheel of daily life greased. Corruption was a matter of survival on both sides. Seeing how easily this happened, not just to us but to others around us, made me wonder whether corruption is just a moral issue. I know that Koreans I met were very good people, but if corruption is mostly a moral issue, why did these good people participate in so easily? And they are far from an anomaly. Today, more than two-thirds of the countries measured by Transparency International, the international NGO committed to combating corruption, score lower than 50 out of a possible 100 on the annual Corruption Perception Index. A score of 0 is very corrupt, 100 is very clean. The average score across the world is 43. According to the organization, 6 billion of total 7.6 billion people in the world live in countries with corrupt governments. That's a lot of people. It's hard to estimate the chilling effect corruption or the threat of corruption has on impoverished countries, especially when the mere perception of corruption impedes investment that can help those countries create wealth and prosperity. But we know that the impact is enormous. In most of today's prosperous countries, Proper enforcement of laws against corruption followed investment in innovation that either created new markets or grew unconnected to existing ones. If we get the sequence right, we can begin to stoke progress in even the most corrupt countries in the world today. History has proved that out time and again. Fighting corruption often feels like playing a game of whack a mole, where a player uses a hammer to hit toy moles that appears at random from different holes on a playing surface. You hit one and another moles pop up in another hole. You expend so much energy hitting and hitting and hitting that eventually throw up your hands in despair. This has made us wonder if we are focused too much on symptoms of corruption instead of seeking to truly understand its causes. To get to the bottom of this, we must ask two important questions. First, why is overt corruption so much more pervasive in poorer countries than in rich ones? And second, how did many of today's prosperous countries become less overtly corrupt? As we will see, answering this question will provide a framework that can help reduce the prevalence of corruption in many of the world's poorest countries. Understanding corruption. Corruption is not a recent phenomenon. Many of today's prosperous countries were once very corrupt. In fact, some were as corrupt as many poor countries today. But corruption is not a permanent phenomenon either, or at least it doesn't have to be. Although we know there are still individual causes of corruption in even the most admired countries in the world, and America is no exception, it is no longer a pervasive part of these cultures. So, what caused the change? You might quickly list off what seems to be an obvious answer: good leadership and governance from the top, a change in the moral values of the society, or the right institution being put in place. But we don't believe those fundamentally change the prevalence of tolerance for corruption in a society. This is important to recognize because so many anti corruption programs are directed almost exclusively at governance and operate on a foundation of instilling a sense of right and wrong. If there were a key to fighting corruption, why have these very worthy efforts overall have relatively less sustained impact on winning the war on corruption? According to most recent Corruption Perception Index report published by Transparency International, the majority of countries are making little or no progress in ending corruption. So even with intense international focus and a flood of resources to combat the problem, including initiatives to inculcate a fundamental sense of integrity in children, progress has been very slow. We believe that people born in poor societies are not somehow missing the fundamental moral fiber of those of us fortunate enough to be born in most prosperous circumstances, nor are they simply ignorant that there is a better way. Corruption is a better way or work around a utility in a place where there are few better options. Corruption is being hired for a job to be done, or more specifically, to help people make progress in a particular circumstance. This is an important insight. Once we understand why people turn to corruption, we can begin to see the different approaches to solving the problem. Why do people hire corruption? So, to begin the process of building trust and transparency, we have to understand why people hire corruption to solve their problems in the first place. We have uncovered three powerful reasons. First, the vast majority of individuals in society wants to make progress. From the poor person looking for employment to a wealthy person looking to gain more status. Most of us want to improve our financial, social, and emotional well-being. It is why we go to school, go on vacation, and also to the places of worship. It is also why we save money, buy homes, start businesses, and run for office. Each of those things, in one way or another, helps us feel like we are making progress in life. When society offers us few legitimate options to make progress, corruption becomes more attractive. Second, every individual, just like every company, has a cost structure. In business, the company's cost structure refers to the combination of fixed and variable costs it incurs in order to run its business. It defines how much the company must spend to design, make, sell, and support a product. For example, when a company spends $100 to create and deliver a product to a customer, in order to make a profit, it must sell a product for more than 100. Similarly, individuals also have a cost structure, how much money they spend to maintain a particular lifestyle. This includes things such as rent or mortgage payment, school fees, hospital bills, food, and so on. And just like companies, individuals must also have revenues, income from their work or investments that surpass their cost. Understanding this simple revenue cost relationship can help predict circumstances where the likelihood of corruption will be high and the efficacy of anti corruption intervention. In essence, if anti corruption programs don't fundamentally affect the revenue cost equation, they are unlikely to be sustainable. For illustration, consider this simple example. If a police officer in India earns 20,000 rupees a month, approximately $295, but has a cost structure that demands he spend $400 a month, he is going to be susceptible to corruption, regardless of what the laws dictate. As a result, one can predictably expect the average police officer to demand bribes, especially in a society where law enforcement and prosecution of corruption crime is not prevalent. It's not that he is inherently a bad person. In fact, personally, I believe that people are inherently good, but circumstances of his life dictate that he make difficult choices to survive. The third reason people hire corruption is that most individuals, regardless of income level, will seek to subvert the prevailing law enforcement strategy in order to make progress and benefit themselves. According to Harvard academics Edward Glaser and Andrew Schleifer, who studied the rise in regulations in the United States at the turn of the 20th century, human beings are hardwired to make the best decision for themselves in the circumstances. When we are confronted with a law that limits our ability to do something we want to do, most of us instinctively make a mental calculation. Do I need to obey this law, or can I get away with disobeying it? And which way will I be better off? The reasoning behind these insights is quite straightforward. To live according to the laws established by the state requires effort. And so the average rational people will juxtapose the benefit of obeying the law with the consequences of disobedience. If the scale tips toward disobedience, then it is actually irrational for the individual to obey the law, no matter how good for the society it might seem. Consider the fact that so many of us all over the world float the speed limit when there are no police officers in the sight. 20 years ago, having a fuzzbuster, a portable police radar detector, was almost a status symbol in America. These days, the community-based GPS smartphone application, which allows us to warn each other when a police car is lurking behind the bushes up ahead. We have developed a social network-enabled product that is dependent on many of us agreeing we should help one another avoid getting caught in a speed traps. We want to make progress, get to where we are going quickly, and willingly ignore the laws that informs us of the speed limit, because we believe we are ultimately better off making that choice. While the circumstances may differ, the calculation process rarely ever does. But societies evolve. The path, however, from a society steeped in corruption to one where trust and transparency thrive typically follows a predefined and often predictable pattern with three phases: overt and unpredictable corruption, followed by covert and predictable corruption, ultimately transitioning to what we call a transparent society. Just because a particular country is categorized as being in the phase 1 doesn't mean it doesn't have some component of phase 2. Instead of thinking that these three phases of distinct absolutes, think of them as 3 points of a spectrum. Our assumption is that we all want to end up as close to phase 3 as possible, a society where trust and transparency are valued. History tells us that the path from corruption to transparency is, in many of the world's most admired countries, has followed a relatively predictable path through these phases. Understanding how these phases evolve is essential in our quest to understand the transparency required for healthy economies. Phase 1: Overt and Unpredictable. The phase 1 is what we call overt and unpredictable corruption, and this is where many poor countries find themselves. In these countries, contracts are difficult to enforce, government institutions are hard to trust, and corruption scandals are commonplace. Travel to any of these countries and pick up a newspaper, and you will see a headline in front page about gross mismanagement of funds by business and political elites. Many of the countries in this phase get a low score in Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index. It is very difficult for capital to be deployed in this kind of environment. Investors understandably shy away from this kind of unpredictability and opacity. For example, imagine doing business in Venezuela, where at the time of this writing the governments can no longer fund the social programs that provide for the basic needs for its people. Although the situation in Venezuela might seem hopeless, it is important to know that many prosperous and advanced nations have come from similar circumstances. In the late 1940s, for instance, Taiwan was quite corrupt and unpredictable. Mayors and local public officials handed out favors to their cronies and lined their own pockets in the process, and many forms of corruption, such as bribery, embezzlement, nepotism, and even organized crime, went unchecked. Taiwan, however, has since become a very successful and productive economy and ranks 29th out of 180 in the Corruption Perception Index. In this first phase of society's evolution, especially when the country is poor, a corruption fighting strategy focused primarily on instituting new laws does not in reality do enough to curb corruption. In fact, it is likely to make things worse, as the premium is placed on finding ways to work around the laws that get in people's way of making progress. In addition, many poor countries are unable to properly enforce the law. It just so happens that law enforcement is costly and financially, socially, and politically. This is not to say that corruption goes without notice. Protests against corruption is massive and frequent all over the world. This fervor has led to a proliferation of anti-corruption candidates throwing their hats in the ring for key political positions. Sometimes they actually win. Russia's Vladimir Putin and Venezuela's Hugo Chavez, now deceased, for instance, came to power promising to eradicate corruption. Let's just say that those campaigns didn't pan out as voters might have hoped, even in the rare case of genuinely good leaders with a powerful will to transform a country. Take, for example, Nelson Mandela's influence on South Africa in the years he led the country. Corruption does not magically disappear with good intention from the top. When Mandela was elected as president of post-apartheid South Africa in 1994, he was without a question one of the most universally admired leaders in the world. 27 years of political imprisonment had not dampened his will to make South Africa a better place. If anything, they had made it stronger. We still think Mandela today as embodiment of good leadership, although he professed to be an ordinary man who became a leader only because of extraordinary circumstances. The dean of Harvard Business School, Nitin Nohria, said at the time of Mandela's death, he exemplified the characteristics of leadership we value most highly: integrity, morality, compassion, and humility. But even during the most hopeful years of his tenure, South Africa was and has remained since mired in corruption. In fact, in the years since Mandela stepped down, corruption has gotten worse. Jacob Zuma, who became president after Mandela's initial successor was pushed from office, was dubbed South Africa's Teflon president for his ability to brush off an extraordinary number of corruption allegations and scandals in his 8th year in office. How did South Africa, so hungry for change during Mandela's leadership, slide so far and so quickly away from the hope that he represented? By most accounts, South Africa possesses most of the institutional features necessary to combat corruption: a much admired constitution, an independent judiciary, and a robust media. In most indices of corruption, including those produced by Transparency International, South Africa is still only ranked somewhere in the middle, a ranking that has actually deteriorated year after year. South Africa's struggle is not unique. 5 years after Liberia's Ellen Johnson Sirleaf became Africa's first democratically elected female president, Sirleaf was awarded one of the highest international honors, the Nobel Peace Prize, for her leadership in securing peace in Liberia. She spent years focusing on building and rebuilding the nation's democratic institution and strengthening the position of women. But even with such international acclaim, Sirleaf's leadership was not able to fully transform Liberia, where Transparency International reported that 69% of people admitted to paying a bribe in 2016 for access to basic services like healthcare and education. Sirleaf eventually left office, with the country still facing what she has dubbed public enemy number one. When she took office more than a decade ago, we have not fully met the anti-corruption pledge that we made in 2006, Sirleaf told lawmakers in her final State of Nation address. It is not because of the lack of political will to do so, but because of intractability of dependency and dishonesty cultivated from years of deprivation and poor governance. Corruption is not primarily about lack of good leadership, although that's certainly part of it. The causal factors are far more fundamental. Corruption is about hiring the most expedient solutions for what seems to be, in the moment, the greatest good of the option available to us. Phase 2. Covert and predictable. The second phase in the corruption spectrum is covert and predictable corruption. In this phase, corruption is more or less an open secret. Think of the film Casablanca, in which police captain Louis Renault professes to be shocked to find out that there is gambling in Rick's thriving, illicit nightclubs, an establishment that routinely greases Renault's palms. People are aware that there is corruption, but it's baked into the system. Because development is happening in parallel, corruption is seen as a necessary cost of doing business. The transition from unpredictable to predictable corruption can be very expensive, economically and politically, and primarily requires the creation of new markets, not laws. Most people who engage in corruption know they should not do what they are doing. New laws only help solve a problem when there is confusion about what to do and when a government should capability to enforce the laws. Consider China. For by some estimates, corruption could be costing Chinese government as much as $86 billion annually. This more than GDP. That's more than GDP of 61 countries. Since 2000, between $1 trillion to and $4 trillion is estimated to have left the country. And some of those funds have been linked to government officials, including President Xi Jinping's brother-in-law. According to one report, the net worth of 153 communist Chinese parliamentarians topped 650 billion in 2017, up about a third from the previous year. That's larger than GDP of Finland and Norway combined. Note that China and many other poor countries have tried to eradicate corruption, primarily by using laws, but with limited success. Paradoxically, the more laws these countries enacted to fight corruption, the more corruption has seemed to spread. China, for instance, has more than 1,200 laws, rules, and directives against corruption. But what good is a law if law providing bodies has neither the muscle, the money, nor the will to enforce the law? At the same time, it is hard to argue with China's recent development and the influx of foreign direct investment over the past 4 decades. In 1970, China's GDP per capita was approximately $112. Today it is about $8,200. Back then, life expectancy was 59 years. Today it is about 76 years. The country has grown at an annual average rate of more than 10% and has accounted for approximately 40% of the world's global growth during this period. It's notable, however, that even as China experiences this growth, the country is still ranked 77th out of 180 countries on Transparency International corruption ranking, below Senegal and on par with Trinidad and Tobago. Corruption has not prevented development from taking roots. Perhaps most telling of all is China's meteoric increase in FDI over the past 4 decades. In 1980s, FDI into China was around $400 million. In 2016, FDI totaled more than $170 billion and 42,400% increase. In fact, from 2006 to 2016, more than $2.3 trillion of FDI flowed into China. Did the foreign investors who poured trillions of dollars into China not knew that corruption was widespread in China? Why didn't they wait for China to eradicate corruption before investing? It is primarily because the type of corruption in China differs from that of other countries in the first phase. It's covert but predictable and thus can be included in the calculation of the cost of doing business in China. Even though development is happening in China, as we mentioned earlier, the country has lifted close to 1 billion people out of poverty over the past few decades. We all agree that it is not yet a transparent society and that this is still progress to be made for prosperity to become sustainable in the long term. A nation must transition in the third phase. Phase 3. Transparency. In 2017, total lobbying in the United States totaled more than $3.3 billion. Lobbyists are employed to influence governments in order to enact laws that are favored to their causes, industries, or particular interests. But even with billions of dollars influencing America's government officials, the country still ranks a respectable 16th out of 180 countries in Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index. But even with billions of dollars influencing America's government officials, the country still ranks a respectable 16th out of 180 countries in Transparency International Corruption Perception Index. Corruption is largely frowned upon in America and is routinely rooted out and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. The 1977 Foreign Corrupt Practices Act (FCPA) serves as a deterrent to would-be corrupting American firms that operate outside the country or international firms that operate in the United States. Walmart, Siemens, Avon, Alstom, a French international industrial group, and many other companies have run afoul of FCPA and have paid hundreds of millions of dollars in fines as a consequences. So how are these two things consistent? We openly spend billions of dollars in influencing our governments, but we also aggressively pursue and prosecute those engaged in corruption. Beside the fact that lobbying is legal, lobbying is also fairly transparent. Curious American can get data from the Senate office of the public record and find out who is lobbying for whom and for what cause. In addition to the transparency, the American economy is also relatively predictable. Though America is not immune from corruption and reasonable, people may disagree on how corrupt America really is. What's different and hopeful is that corruption in America is often exposed, prosecuted, and punished. You don't have to look very hard to find headlines of corrupt politicians in America. Three of the most recent speakers in the House of Representatives from our home state of Massachusetts have all been convicted felons on corruption charges. Former Illinois Governor Rod Blagojevich was tried, convicted, and sentenced to 14 years in the prison for corruption charges when he tried to sell former President Barack Obama's vacated Senate seat. But America did not always prosecute, much less convict a sentence. It's Blagojevich. So how did America evolve from a country where corruption was rife to one in which transparency has become a norm? Boss tweets America. Just as it is difficult to imagine a poor United States, it is also difficult to imagine an overtly corrupt America where such incidents would not be investigated. But there was a time when corruption in America rivaled corruption in some of the poorest countries today. Perhaps more than anyone, 19th century American politician William Major Boss tweet exemplified what it meant to be overtly corrupt. Born in 1823, Tweed entered politics at an early age and was elected city alderman by the time he was 28 years old. After spending several years in office, Tweed opened a law office, even though he was not a lawyer. Through the office, he received payments from large corporations for his legal services. But these payments were mostly extortions. With this fund, Tweed purchased many acres of Manhattan real estate and grew his influence in New York City police. This was just the beginning. The Tweed Ring at its height was an engineering marvel, strong and solid, strategically deployed to control key power points, the courts, the legislature, the treasury, and the ballot box. Biographer Kenneth Anchorman wrote, "Its fraud has a grandeur of scale and an elegance of structure. Money laundering profit sharing, and organization. During his time as the boss of Tammany Hall, Tweed, who was also a member of the United States House of Representatives, stole a sum estimated to between $1 billion and $4 billion in today's worth. In 1889, a cartoon titled "The Bosses of the Senate" is the satirical weekly puck depicted perfectly the overtness of America's corruption at the time. The cartoon shows members of U.S. Senate working feverishly as representatives of specific business interests, such as Steel Beam Trust, Copper Trust, Sugar Trust, and so on. Watched from the balcony above, there are several entrances into the Senate chamber. One reads, "This is the Senate of Monopolists, by the monopolist." The door representing the people's entrance is closed. Corruption was so severe and widespread that President Woodrow Wilson, 1913 to 1921, has to address it during his presidency. In 1913, Wilson wrote in one of his books, "There have been courts in the United States which were controlled by the private interest. There have been corrupt judges. There have been judges who acted as other man's servant and not as a servant of the public." Oh, that there are some shameful chapters in the story. The judicial process is the ultimate safeguard of the things that we must hold stable in this country. But suppose that safeguard is corrupted. Suppose that it does not guard my interests and yours, but guard merely the interests of a very small group of individuals. Then where is your safeguard? Corruption was also pervasively in major infrastructure projects like the railroads and roads in the United States. Although the railroads in the 1800s and the roads in the 1900s were good for America, they also brought with them an unprecedented level of corruption. When the United States government got into the business of railroads and extended subsidies to contractors, those subsidies were often given based on the number of miles of the railroad tracks built, not on the quality or effectiveness of the track. Contractors built long and windy railroads, often using subpar materials, and they mostly competed for federal favors instead of railroad customers. Consider what's happened with the road construction after automobile boom in the early part of the 20th century. Thomas McDonald, when administrator of United States Federal Highway Administration, visited road construction job where he found waste and soggy rock in abundance. Earl Swift notes in his book The Big Roads, localities often got about a dime's worth of the road for every dollar they spent. Contractors have carved the state among themselves so that each would be assured all the bridge work in a particular territory, an arrangement that would cost taxpayers twice in contracts that were wildly overpriced. Had Transparency International's annual ranking existed back then, America's would have been high in the list of least would not have been high on the list of least corrupt countries. But America over time found its safeguard and today is number 16 on the list. Was that due primarily to better law, better politicians being elected, better institutions being created? Certainly, all of those things helped create support the culture of transparency we now have, but they didn't cause America to suddenly stop being corrupt. As more and more Americans created more and more wealth for themselves and found better ways to make a living, their voices of dissatisfaction with corruption became louder. Politically, the rage of victims counted for very little in 1840, not much in 1860. By 1890, it was a roaring force. Its House Stanford law professor Lawrence Friedman put it. Clearly, corruption was not eradicated by 1890, but by then we see the process by which it was evolving in America. The hope of something better has begun. And so, what we learned from America's development is that it happened in spite of widespread corruption and unpredictability in the country. Anti corruption in America was not triggered primarily by legislation or an increased intensity in the law enforcement. It came about because the fundamental equation of how average and rich Americans could make money, make progress, and make a living for themselves and their families began to change. American capitalism in 1920s was less corrupt and less abusive of workers and consumers than it was in the 1900s. Glazer and Schleifer concluded in their paper, we find that today's capitalism in America, while not perfect, is certainly superior to American capitalism in 1920s. Development often precedes successful anti-corruption program, not the other way around. While over time some people become more corrupt because that's what they have practiced all their lives. Personally, I don't believe most people wake up in the morning just to be corrupt. When there are few alternatives to help people make progress, corruption often stands out as the most viable option. But when a better way presents itself, the process that leads to transparency begins. We can see this happening in countries all over the world. Of monarchs and men, consider how corruption evolved in Europe, where perhaps the most obvious form of corruption, absolute monarchies that seized land, appropriated assets, and killed citizens at will, were common. Monarchs have been likened to robbers who are permanently on the prowl, always probing, always searching for something to steal. Corruption permeated European society as bands of armed men with the secret blessings of some level of nobility would terrorize whole districts with blackmail or other draconian means of extorting money or resources. No age, gender, or place were exempted. Even commoners could, with enough money, corrupt judges and juries in ways unthinkable today. Although Europe's transition from overt corruption to transparency was slower and perhaps more painful than America's, it was ultimately triggered in part by a similar engine. Innovations that created new markets for many of the continent's non-consumers, which offered viable options for the average person to make a living. The new markets as forced the hand of government to become more creative in how they taxed and governed their citizens. As societies became less agrarian, wealth such as gold, silver, and other precious metals became more mobile, and government needed to create better ways to tax their citizens. Monarchs innovated new ways of tapping the private wealth of their citizens. Among the most significant was the creation of parliaments, fora in which they could trade concession in public policies for the payment of public revenues, concluded Harvard professor Robert Bates on prosperity and violence, the political economy of development. Government chose seduction as overbullying because all of the sudden citizens could move their value more easily. A new type of economy has emerged. From one that plundered wealth came one that sought its creation. Additionally, as monarchs continued to fight more wars and conquer more territories, they needed to borrow larger and larger sums of money. There are numerous accounts, for instance, of the English king in the 17th century always being short of cash. Then and today, there are few challenges worse than a government being short of cash when it is at war, and unlike today, when sovereign debt is typically viewed as safer than private debt, although this does depend on the country in question. Back then, it was riskiest type of debt in the market. So sovereign debt was larger than private debt and took longer to repay, and the monarchs could renege on the debt with few consequences. So investors typically loaned monarchs money and whose monies were now more mobile as they were no longer tied to land caused monarch to create less corrupt and more transparent institutions. These institutions at the onset were less than ideal, but they created a fair amount of predictability for the investors in the euro. The courts, for instance, focused more on delivering judgment expeditiously than they did on delivering justice accurately. As such, investors could predictably estimate how long court cases would take and how that might affect their business dealings. This is important because research suggests that the unpredictability in a system, even one rife with corruption, might actually be more harmful than corruption itself. As European markets grew, the court system grew as well. In relevance, this affected the culture of average European and caused them to place immense value on these new transparent institutions. The new institution worked, but it's crucial to understand why they worked. Many of these institutions which promoted transparency were tied to new markets that sustained them and make them necessary. Clearly, circumstances today are different. Not every poor country is engaged in war and ruled by a government that is desperately in need of cash. Like many European governments 500 years ago, but the fundamental equation remains the same. There needs to be a good enough reasons for people in society to want to obey the laws of the land. Think of how difficult it has been for the government of Argentina to get small contractors to declare their income in order to pay taxes. But Iguana Fix, offering them something beyond moral responsibility, the ability to make progress in the struggle of their own lives, was able to change that. Transparency take roots. Even in countries that look very different from United States and countries in Europe, we see a similar pattern in the path of transparency. If anyone had told General Park Chung-hee, South Korea's dictatorial leaders from 1963 to 1979, that his daughter, Park Geun-hye, would someday become president of the country, he surely wouldn't have been surprised. But if that person has on to tell the general that his daughter would be impeached by South Korea's parliament and be charged with corruption, he might have been stunned. But that is exactly what has happened in South Korea. In late 2016, Park Geun-hye, General Park's daughter, was removed from office for alleged bribery, abuse of power, and other crimes related to corruption. In March 2017, the Constitutional Court of Korea unanimously upheld the parliament's decision, and in April 2018, the former president was sentenced to 24 years in prison. To appreciate just how significant that is, consider the fact that South Korea was ruled by General Park until his assassination in 1979. Under his dictatorship, the scale of economic development achieved by Korean government was enviable, but the scale of corruption was equally indisputable. The government handed over five out favors to several large corporations, and those corporations in turn gave kickbacks to government officials. This propped up the system, and as long as the economy was growing, the corruption seemed relatively minuscule, but it was not minuscule at all. Measures of institutional quality based on bureaucracy, rule of law, expropriation, risk, and contract repudiation by government is successful in successful East Asian countries in mid 1980s was only slightly better than in many poor performing countries. Is how economist Mustaq Khan describes corruption and institutional development in the region. Fast-growing Indonesia scored the same as Burma and Ghana, and South Korea, Malaysia, and Thailand, the same as Cote d'Ivoire. The corruption index created by Transparency International showed that the rapidly growing East Asian countries had corruption scores in 1980s the same that were little different from those of other developing countries. Yet South Korea today is well on its way to become a more transparent society. As societies invest more in innovation, which creates prosperity for their citizens, their corruption fighting system will slowly improve, and the prospect of impeaching a corrupt head of state will become not only possible but probable. Many of today's corrupt countries have potential to become more transparent too. But in order to get there, we have to get the sequence right. What then must we do? So we can so what we can do to reduce corruption without understanding that people are trying to make progress in their lives when they hire corruption, we make two suggestions. First, what if we stop focusing all our efforts on fighting corruption without simultaneously providing a substitute for what people can hire? Corruption will be incredibly difficult to minimize. Like that game of whack-a-mole, as soon as one effort to tamp it down succeeds, another form of corruption will spring up. The circumstances in which a particular state finds itself should determine which institutional or law enforcement mechanism it employs. Suggest Harvard Glacier Schiffler. Their model proposes that when the administrative capacity of the government is severely limited, and both its judges and regulators are vulnerable to intimidation and corruption, it might be better to accept existing market failure and externalities that to deal with them through either the administrative or the judicial process. For if a country does attempt to correct market failures, justice will be subverted and resources will be wasted on subversion without successfully controlling market failures. In other words, if a country does not have the capacity to enforce the laws on the book, it will matter very little how many new laws, institutions, and public mandates are created to combat corruption or impose transparency. Instead, the earnest, poor country government continuing to aggressively fight corruption with the very limited resources they have, that would happen if they instead focused on enabling creation of new markets that help citizens to solve their everyday problem. Once enough markets are created, people have to have an interest in those markets succeeding. Government will begin to generate more revenue to improve their codes, laws, enforcement, and legislative system. In addition, markets begin to provide jobs that give people a viable alternatives to accumulating wealth through corrupt means. Asking people to fire corruption without giving them anything else to hire is not very realistic, and as the data so often doesn't work. Integrating and internalizing your organizational operations. Second, we must focus on what we can control. By integrating and internalizing our operation in order to reduce opportunities for corruption to occur, organizations understand the importance of vertical and horizontal integration in order to control cost and build predictability into their operations. This is one of the reasons many large companies in emerging market vertically and horizontally integrate operations that might seem unnecessary in more prosperous countries. that, as we described earlier, for example, Tolaram Noodle Companies, maker of Indomie noodles, supplies its own electricity and build a distribution and retail network to guarantee stable predictable supply. The more components of an organizational business model that it brings in-house, the more opportunity the organization has to reduce corruption. In a sense, it is like the organization has a fresh slate upon which it can create new rules that define the reward and punishment system within the organization. This is exactly what Roshan, the leading telecommunication provider in Afghanistan, will did in order to reduce corruption. With the score of 15 to 100, Afghanistan ranks 177th out of 180 in Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index. A recently released Transparency International report suggests that the country is unlikely to meet its commitment to curbing corruption in spite of efforts throughout the country to do so just that. But Roshan understand that to overcome the culture of corruption that has been cultivated in the country for a long time, it has to do something different. Many people might forget that it was like to what it was like to make a phone call in Afghanistan 2 decades ago. But thankfully, Philip Oswald reminds us in his book The Coming Prosperity. He quotes Karim Khoza, founder of Roshan, remarked that unless you were very rich, if you wanted to make a phone call, you had to walk 700 kilometers, 435 miles to the nearest country. There was one cellular phone company which was charging $500 for the handset and $12 per minute for international call, or $3 for local calls. You had to bribe their salespeople even to see you. Today, Roshan serves approximately 6 million people that has earned a reputation for operating ethically with a 1,200 people workforce that consists almost exclusively of Afghanis. But achieving this has not been easy. In 2009, Roshan was spending upward of $1,500 per local Afghani employee, training them on both the technicalities of business and on ethics. Roshan didn't simply stop at ethical training, however, in the hopes that people would always appeal to their better natures. The company understood that it had to integrate further, and so Roshan set up a government relations department that handles corruption allegations and reports. Whenever employees were asked to pay bribes, they were instructed to report it to this department, which would in turn report these incidences to Afghanistan's ministers, donor organizations, and members of the media. Today, the company is perceived as a beacon of hope and a community assets in Afghanistan. Afghanistan still ranks poorly on many corruption metrics, but the case of Roshan shows that it is possible to avert corruption even in the most difficult business environment. If transparency can begin to take roots in present-day Afghanistan, we are hopeful that it can work in other countries as well. From pirate to paying subscriber, corruption for most people, especially in poor countries, is simply a means to an end. If they had an alternative, most people would not choose to hire corruption to make progress. And sort of enforcing morality, often an expensive and difficult strategy with mixed results. We cannot think of better strategy of curbing corruption than the subsequent creation of new markets. Consider what happened in the music industry in America at the turn of this century, where a relatively rapid succession or culture of piracy and illegal music sharing gave way to one in which customers opted to pay for streaming music instead. If you are old enough to remember the golden age of mixtape, you will remember that after the innovation of dual cassette recorder, copying music was easy. So easy that once you bought a tape, it it was easy for you to make copies for yourself and your friends. And many of us did mixtapes for parties, mixtapes to share with girlfriends or boyfriends, mixtapes for road trips. With our homemade mixtapes, we could create just the right musical montage to play whenever we wanted it. Music industry executives spent years lobbying Congress for stricter copyright protection and millions of dollars in awareness campaign designed to deter people from stealing music this way. But none of them made a dent in the practice of making copies. Essayist Geoffrey O'Brien put the personal mixtape, the most widely practiced American art form. Put another way, it was art of stealing from artists we loved. All of a sudden, America has become the nation of thieves who stole music, and few people outside the music industry seem to care. In fact, things only got worse for the music industry with the invention of Napster, a pioneering peer to peer file sharing technology that made the practice of taping seem quite quiet by comparison. Suddenly, people all around the world could share their music, all of it, anytime, with anyone, and they did indiscriminately. The situation got so big and unwieldy that practically everyone in the music industry took Napster to court, and the music industry won. Napster had to shut down its operation, eventually declaring bankruptcy. Although the music industry might have won the battle, it lost the war to stop music-loving Americans to illegally sharing music. Illegal sharing just went further underground. In an extraordinary confession book titled How Music Got Free, journalist Stephen Witt chronicled his own exhilarating foray into the world of music piracy and his eventual change of heart. He did not stop selling music because he had a moral revelation. Rather, after years of reveling in the furtive online music piracy industry, Witt finally decided to throw in the towel in 2014 because it was simply not worth the trouble. Piracy was becoming too expensive and time consuming. After a certain point, it was cheaper to subscribe to Spotify and Netflix. Witt writes, individual ownership of private digital property was disappearing. In the new paradigm, digital goods were corporate property, and with users paying for a limited access, using Spotify for the first time, I immediately understood that the corporation had won. Its scope and convenience made torrenting music seem antique. For the first time, the legal business was offering a product that was superior to that was available underground. The music industry might have been able to knock down music pirates here and there, but until it truly understood why people were hiring those alternative solutions, it was never going to prevail. It was playing its own game of whack-a-mole. The same is true throughout society. We might win against cases of corruption, corrupt politicians and corrupt practices, but until we truly understand why people hire corruption, we will continue to spend our hard-earned resources fighting this problem. We aren't suggesting that the world turn a blind eye to corruption, waiting for a market creating innovation to eventually push it aside. We understand that this process will take time, but we must aggressively complement our existing effort with market creating innovations if we are to have a fighting chance against corruption. Were the agents in South Korea demanding that I pay safety insurance 40 years ago corrupt? By our definition, they were. What about the police officers in impoverished countries who take bribes? Absolutely. Are these people engaging in corruption because they are somehow morally bankrupt individuals? I don't think so. For each of these people, corruption is a solution to the struggle and often the most cost effective way for them to make progress in their societies and to support their families. And as we see time and again, simply enacting new laws or even harsher penalties isn't going to make them change their behavior. It just drives the corruption underground. We are not saying that corruption can be completely eradicated from any society, but we believe it can be significantly mitigated, and this matters to the society's potential for growth because limiting corruption makes room for predictability, which ultimately improves trust and transparency. And just like prosperity, achieving transparency is a process. When examined, widely held belief that establishing solid institutions and abolishing corruption are precondition to an economy's development. We find again and again that innovation, especially market creating innovation, can be critical catalyst for change. Market creating innovation have the ability to pull in what's needed regardless of the existing of sound institution or the state of corruption. Those will follow, as will, we believe, the most feasible piece of development puzzle: infrastructure.